What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon466cards, and today we're going to talk about the importance of good ownership and smart management on a player's card values. On your screen right now, you can see here I have titles as one of the 4 criteria I use to determine which players have long-term value potential. And when we talk about titles, we need to talk about management and ownership, because through drafts, trades, and free agency, management and ownership directly impact a player's ability to win championships, which are then tied to a player's legacy. And that ultimately is what drives player value, right? And player card values is what I really mean there. So I'm going to give you a few examples of good and bad management and how it has impacted a player's legacy. So the first example we have is Matt Ishbia. Very recently, the new owner of the Phoenix Suns. He bought them on February the 6th, as you can see on your screen. A few days later, February the 10th, they traded for Kevin Durant and traded away a bunch of stuff. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, 4 first-round picks, and a pick swap in 2028. Then later that summer, they traded for Bradley Beal and gave away everything else that they have. And so they basically have nothing left in terms of assets. And yet they were an absolute disaster on the court this season, got ousted early, and they have nothing left to trade, and they're stuck with this roster. And that really impacts the legacy and the card values of Devin Booker. And so this is a case of Matt Ishbia came in as a new owner, and now Devin Booker cards are in the tank because there's really no way for him to win a championship with this current roster. Now, if we stick with the Suns and we go back a few years, there was another owner. This was the previous owner, Robert Sarver, who, just Google him. He's a terrible guy. But he also torpedoed Steve Nash and the 7 seconds or less Suns through his management. So what he used to do was basically give away first-round draft picks because he didn't want to pay them. So he gave away basically the first-round draft pick that eventually led to the Celtics drafting Rajon Rondo in 2006. And then on top of that, he gave away the draft rights to Rudy Fernandez for cash because he didn't want to pay him. After that, he traded away 2 first-round draft picks here. You can see 2 first-round draft picks to dump the contract of Kurt Thomas. And that was essentially 3-4 first-round picks being given away for no good reason other than Robert Sarver was cheap. And so Steve Nash and his teams in the early to mid 2000s were basically operating without any first round draft picks. There was no pipeline of young talent to help them. And so Steve Nash's legacy was altered significantly by the fact that he would never have young talent to help him get over the hump and win a championship. And that, I would say, is the one thing holding Steve Nash from being considered an all-time great. And that obviously has impacted his legacy and his card values. If we go over to Joe Smith, if you're unfamiliar with Joe Smith, he was a player who was drafted first overall and then ended up on the T-Wolves a few years later. And there was a scandal involving him and the T-Wolves owner, Glenn Taylor, and Kevin McHale, who was the GM, where they basically found ways to circumvent the cap. The NBA found out and stripped the T-Wolves of 5 first-round draft picks. You can see here at Highland Blue from 2001 to 2005. They eventually gave back 2 of them, but 3 of their first-round draft picks in the early 2000s were just taken away. And that basically left Kevin Garnett with no real way to win a championship. As good as he was, we'll never know how great he could have been in his prime because the team around him never had draft picks for 3 of 5 years. And that impacts his ability to win a championship and ultimately impacts his legacy, and which the downstream impact of that is the ability for his card prices to really have a lot of long-term value. We'll never know. Could he have been as good as Tim Duncan with better talent around him? I don't know. Nobody will ever know if they had drafted better, if they had those picks. But because of ownership and management, we never got to know. And so if you had KG cards, maybe they would have been worth a lot more than they are now because he had to leave the team, go to Boston to then win a championship and contend every year. Now, if we go to my Sixers, I won't spend too much time on this, but here's things that they did. They drafted Mikal Bridges and traded him away the day of the draft. They traded away the number 3 pick to draft Markelle Fultz, and of course the number 3 pick ended up going to the Celtics, who drafted Jason Tatum, and then they gave a near max contract to Tobias Harris. Try winning with an albatross of 5 years at 180 million on your roster during the prime of your star players contract. I'm just gonna leave that there. But now we're gonna show you some examples of good management and how that has helped a player's legacy. First one is the most obvious one. The Chicago Bulls traded for Scottie Pippen. They traded to get the number 5 pick to draft Scottie Pippen, and they traded away the number 8 pick and some other stuff to get him. Without this trade, Michael Jordan's legacy and the number of championships he won would have been significantly changed. For the worse, obviously. Scottie Pippen is also an all-time great, lockdown defender, literally the Robin to Michael Jordan's Batman, to the point where now people say Pippen to Jordan as another metaphor to use as like the co-star, right? And so think of how we view Michael Jordan now, his legacy, the number of championships he won in his prime, 2 different three-peats. None of that happens without Scottie Pippen, and that doesn't happen unless the GM at the time has the foresight to say, I want to trade up to get Scottie Pippen, right? And that's one example of management leading to the creation of basically the legacy of the greatest player of all time, right? Another example of this is the Spurs trading up to draft Kawhi Leonard at number 15. That, I think, significantly impacts how we perceive Tim Duncan, because Tim Duncan now has 2 separate runs almost, right? And this is his late career, where they went to the finals and lost to the Heat, and then won a title with Kawhi Leonard on the team against the Heat the next year. And as a result, we view Tim Duncan and, to a lesser extent, Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili as having this 15-year run instead of having like an 8-year run, because there's now a championship at the end of it with Kawhi Leonard. Without this, we just think of it as like a 8 to 10-year run, right? And this extends what we consider their, I don't know if you call it dynasty, but their run to 15 years instead of just being around 8 to 10 years when they last won the championship, and I believe it's 06 or 07. And so that makes us think of Tim Duncan being great for basically his entire career, as opposed to if they didn't win this championship or go to the finals, it'd be more of, oh yeah, they were great for like an 8 to 10 year run. Now it's like, oh my God, basically the entire time Tim Duncan was on the court, he was great because his teams went to the finals for a prolonged period of time. And that impacts how we think of Tim Duncan's legacy and how we think of him as a player. And as a result, that impacts his card values, right? So those are some examples of how ownership and management are really important in impacting a player's legacy and their abilities to win a title, and as a result, their card values. Would love to hear your thoughts and comments of, hey, are there other examples that I've included? Obviously, I only focus on basketball. I'm sure this happens for other sports as well. But yeah, would love to hear some other examples in the comments below of other players that were positively or negatively impacted by management and ownership decisions. Thank you, as always, for listening and watching. I will talk to you all soon. Cheers.